Tonight, Trump versus Pelosi. Yes, we've heard this fight before. The president, he's going against the speaker saying that the president's engaging in a cover-up. Those her words. Trump blasting back and says it's time for Democrats to move on and he cannot work with them. We'll look at how this is escalating a political fight and how this is all playing out. Then our legal panel will join us to take a look at a bunch of big stories in the news, including the upcoming release of John Walker Lynn, the American who joined the Taliban. He served his time, but is it safe to release him back into our society? Also, we take a look at the sharp right turn at the High Court and how that could put even landmark cases in jeopardy of being overturned. With all the recent abortion restrictions being passed at the statewide level, this is particularly troubling. Evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. Now, the president today, he just turned the heat up even hotter on his battle with the Democrats. For what happened and the backstory, we turn to senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman. And every time they talk infrastructure, things go south.
Infrastructure Week does not work well, Rich. This was high drama, all of which played out in front of live television cameras. And it came only after it looked like Democrats were gaining a small bit of leverage in their standoff against the White House. Now, that shift began Monday when a federal judge ruled against the president in his suit trying to block Congress from getting financial info from his accounting firm. Trump's legal team is now appealing that decision. This afternoon, a federal judge in Manhattan ruled against the president and his effort to squash congressional subpoenas sent to the two banks that loaned the president money in recent years, Deutsche Bank and Capital One. They can now turn those records over to congressional investigators pending a possible appeal. Meanwhile, there was word this morning of cooperation between the Justice Department and the House Judiciary Committee. The committee will get redacted material and other evidence from the Mueller probe in exchange for them not enforcing a subpoena against the Attorney General. Now, this may not move the needle all that much, but at least both sides were able to find common ground in this case. Plus, the Washington Post got a hold of a draft IRS memo saying the Treasury Department has no legal grounds not to turn over the president's tax returns to Congress unless the president claims executive privilege on them. That's a position that clearly contradicts the rationale that Secretary Steve Mnuchin gave for not giving the returns to Congress. He claimed the request lacked any legitimate legislative purpose. Now, those developments had actually eased some of the pressure off of Nancy Pelosi and gave her ammunition against Democrats who were demanding that she launch an impeachment inquiry against the president. House Democrats met this morning, and that pressure was evident as Pelosi then said this.
We do believe that it's important to follow the facts. We believe that no one is above the law, including the President of the United States, and we believe that the President of the United States is engaged in a cover-up.
We believe the President of the United States is engaged in a cover-up. And from there, she and other top congressional Democrats went to the White House to meet with the president on infrastructure. That meeting did not go well. The president blew up the meeting after just 3 minutes, apparently incensed by Pelosi's earlier comments. After the meeting, he met with reporters in the Rose Garden.
Instead of walking in happily into a meeting, I walk in to look at people that had just said that I was doing a cover-up. I don't do cover-ups. I want to do infrastructure. I want to do it more than you want to do it. I'd be really good at that. That's what I do. But you know what? You can't do it under these circumstances. So get these phony investigations over with.
So to be clear, the president recognized the need and desire to do infrastructure, but he said he won't as long as Democrats are investigating him. And Speaker Pelosi focused on the work that will not get done now as she later chastised the president.
For some reason, maybe it was lack of confidence on his part, that he really couldn't match the greatness of the challenge that we have. He just took a pass. And it just makes me wonder why he did that. In any event, I pray for the President of the United States. And I pray for the United States of America.
Meanwhile, Chuck Schumer took a different approach, noting this pre-produced sign that was on the president's podium that listed all the Mueller facts the president's always referring to, including the words "no collusion, no obstruction" on the right-hand side.
We are interested in doing infrastructure. It's clear the president isn't. Now that he was forced to actually say how he'd pay for it, he had to run away. And he came up with this pre-planned excuse.
Unbelievable. It's like Romper Room, except on steroids. And just so people understood, the president said, Andrew, didn't he, that the reason why the meeting went south was what Speaker Pelosi's comments for the day. The sign was pre-produced.
The sign was
It was
pre-produced.
laid out already. He was going to make this a non-starter to begin with. All right, unbelievable. Andrew, thank you. Now, a lot to unpack, and to help us do that, good friend to the program, former federal prosecutor Joseph Moreno. And Joseph, this isn't really where I planned to go today, but where the president went, I could argue that by definition, not only obstruction, but you're in effect extorting not just Democrats, but the American public, that you won't let the government work if you don't shut down the investigation. I mean, that wasn't part of the Mueller probe because obviously they shut it down before this, but in a normal news cycle, this would be, you know, obstruction on steroids, but instead it's just, oh yeah, you know, I guess this is a regular Wednesday.
Sure, Richard. Well, it's great as always to be with you. And this is a big disappointment because infrastructure was at one point thought to be one of the few issues, maybe the only issue, where the parties could come to the table and perhaps hash out a deal. Maybe they could disagree on how much they want to spend and where the priorities lay, but at the end, that was supposed to be perhaps the one thing they could come together on, and now it looks like that's just not going to happen.
I want to go through a bunch of developments. Tell me which ones you think are significant or just, you know, pro forma almost. Justice Department saying, forget the fight. You don't have to subpoena. We'll give you the redacted information and also the underlying information relating to the specialist counsel. Was that a big concession on their part, or was it inevitable?
It was a smart concession, and it probably was inevitable. And we're going to see with all of these cases, whether it's the underlying evidence of the Mueller report or the redactions of the Mueller report, whether it's the president's tax returns, whether it's the president's financial records, whether it's Don McGahn testifying, there's going to be a general tendency for courts to say Congress has the right to this information or this testimony. It's just a matter of time. And so the point is, the president is wise to choose his battles, and the Justice Department knows it's going to lose this one, and it's much better off coming to the table and coming to some kind of agreement as to what they will produce with respect to the Mueller report and the timeline for producing it, rather than just casting their dice with the court and figuring out, you know, what happens ultimately when the court will ultimately say you must turn over these materials to Congress.
Well, along that lines, do you think there's an inevitability? We talked about what Judge Maida had to say, that no, you know, you got to turn over Mazur's, you know, the accounting firm's documents. We also saw the IRS memo which says, no, we can't just say no outright as a rebuke to the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin. Will these things inevitably get in the hands of Congress? I know there's appeals up the wazoo that'll probably happen as a consequence, but both the rationale of the judge and also what the IRS said, does it lay the groundwork that this is not private information that Congress doesn't have an oversight right to?
Each of these issues has its own nuances, right? On the tax return issue, there's a law that has to be analyzed. On the subpoenas of the financial records, there's other equities. But the overall trend is that Congress has broad, not unlimited, but broad powers to legislate and investigate. So it's going to be very difficult for a judge to say that he or she does not recognize Congress's inherent powers to investigate and get this information. Now, it might take time, and that's perhaps the purpose of all the appeals, is to drag this out, perhaps to the end of the year, perhaps to the end of next year, beyond the 2020 presidential election. I think most of us feel ultimately Congress will get the information in these various different cases. It's just a matter of when, and it's just a matter of what purpose that information will serve when ultimately it sees the light of day.
Let me ask you to put your prosecutor hat back on. And to that end, you must have had over the years, Joe, witnesses that were less than eager to come testify. To that end, Bob Mueller or his subordinates they've made it clear that he'd rather not enter this political fray. To that end, if you're Jerry Nadler, and I know there's a political consideration to this more than, or at least equal to the fact-finding, do you want a reluctant Mueller coming to the stand? You could argue the same, calculation goes to Don McGahn. He's in the private sector now. Most of his clients are on the conservative side. They wouldn't like to see him take down his old boss. Hope Hicks, obviously, she's in the private world as well, and in the communications world, a lot of clients, etc., conservative leaning. You have people who are going to do whatever they can not to go after their former employer. Do you want these people testifying on live TV if they're not going to be, let's say, as transparent as they would for various reasons?
Sure. So the equities are a little different when it comes to Bob Mueller versus the rest of the individuals you cited. In general, people don't like testifying before Congress. It's a stressful, expensive, time-consuming affair. Now, Bob Mueller is known to be a very by-the-book, just the facts, not a big fan of the media or a spectacle kind of guy. So I have no doubt that when he finished his report, he had hoped his job was done and he could go home. However, he also will do his duty. So if there is a subpoena or if there is a request and there's some kind of a negotiation for him to appear, he will do it. He will answer truthfully. He might not go off on tangents. He might not offer opinions, but he will provide the information that is asked of him. I have no doubt about that. Now, the other people you mentioned are in a different category. These are mostly private citizens. They have their own lives. They have their own careers. They have their own feelings, perhaps, their own politics with respect to President Trump and their time with the White House or this administration. So for them, you're right. They probably will be not particularly eager to sit before Congress and answer tough questions about their time in the White House, about this president, about perhaps the campaign in 2016. So it might be a bit of pulling teeth when it comes to those people. It might be a long process to get them before Congress. It might be a negotiation as to what questions they ultimately will answer. But at the end of the day, they cannot resist subpoenas, and they will have to show up, and they will have to answer questions.
Two other quick things. The first one, William Barr. With each passing day, if not week, he says something that boggles the mind. The Attorney General went before an audience and said, my God, the courts. Now, again, he's in charge. He's head of the Department of Justice. He said the courts are thwarting the president's agenda and by issuing rulings that are not in his interest, they're holding him back. And he had the audacity to complain about separation of powers. He's not a dumb guy, Joe. I can't believe the things that he's saying.
He's not a dumb guy, and he's a very smart guy, and he knows this town very well. I think perhaps, though, I would respectfully submit that what he might not really appreciate is the fact that he came into this job under a bit of a cloud, right? And that cloud is due to the fact that he wrote last summer this unsolicited memo questioning the legal theory behind bringing obstruction of justice charges against a sitting president. And that, of course, is exactly what Robert Mueller was investigating and exactly what Bill Barr, as Attorney General, had to rule on as Attorney General. So right off the bat, he has to realize that a significant portion of the population are looking at him with a good degree of skepticism. When he says things like that, like you pointed out, and some other comments in the last few weeks that were not, in my view, the wisest, he's only digging himself in deeper. He's not necessarily doing something wrong, but he is just adding to the criticism that a good portion of the American public feel he does not have the public's interest in mind. He has the president's interest in mind.
I have so many other things I'd love to get into, but they're giving me the rap sign, Joe. Joe Moreno, as always, outstanding job. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Always a pleasure.
All right, everybody, when we come back, our legal panel joins us. And the first story I'll get into with the guys is we'll take a look at the case of the American Taliban, John Walker Lynn. He's set to walk out of a federal prison tomorrow, but the government, they're concerned he is still an extremist. How do we deal with people who've done their time but could still pose a danger to the community?